Out of all the debates on the subject of art, one of the most contentious is the debate between objectivity and subjectivity. There are many different positions on this subject, a lot of them quite nuanced, but I think we can generalize the two main camps as follows. One side believes that the quality of artistic works is objective to a certain degree. There are some variations within this camp. Some people distinguish between craft and aesthetics and argue that one or the other is objective. Some will acknowledge that art isn't really objective in the same way that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is objective, but will then say that sometimes a consensus is so overwhelmingly strong that calling it anything other than objective is to be willfully disingenuous. The other side feels differently. They argue that what's actually disingenuous is the notion that quality can be basically objective, and that this is somehow equivalent to actually objective. The subjective camp sees this as a rhetorical game designed to privilege the opinions of some people over the opinions of others. They see the arguments for objectivity as an attempt to create artificial hierarchies, seemingly for the sole purpose of determining who is right and who is wrong in an argument. It should come as no surprise to anyone who's seen my other videos, especially the ones about taste, that of these two arguments I tend to agree much more with the latter. But the truth is that neither of these positions reflect my real stance on the issue. In fact, no matter how many times I've seen this debate play out, in person, online, in essays and articles, I've never seen anyone present a position like mine. My position on this debate is that the difference between objectivity and subjectivity is kind of like an optical illusion. It only becomes apparent if you view the problem from a certain angle. But if you look at things from a different angle, the distinctions between objectivity and subjectivity begin to disappear. In order to explain what I mean by this, I need to revisit a concept from my earlier video on defining and evaluating art. In that video, I drew a distinction between two different approaches to evaluating art, that I called the prescriptive and observational approaches. The quickest way to summarize the difference between the two is that they each describe a different relationship between values and opinions. In the prescriptive approach, opinions are determined by a set of values, while in the observational approach, values are derived from a set of opinions. For example, let's say there's someone who places a large amount of value on character development. That's a pretty common one, right? Good works of narrative art have lots of character development. In the prescriptive approach, this person might read a book that doesn't have a lot of character development. You know, the characters are pretty flat and shallow, they don't change much over the course of the story, and then they would say, well, this book isn't very good. Simple enough, but there's an issue with this approach, which is that we can say this is how it works every time, but we all know that's not really the case. Sometimes our example individual will read a book like this that doesn't have a lot of character development, and they will find themselves actually liking it. And so in these cases, there's a cognitive dissonance. The person's first-hand experiences with the work are in conflict with their values. And cognitive dissonance is a stressful and uncomfortable thing to experience, to the point where our brains will search for any way to reconcile the conflicting views that cause it. And one of the ways to do this is to say, well, these aren't conflicting positions at all, because they're describing two different things. One is my subjective opinion, and the other is the objective quality of the work. I can like something subjectively while still recognizing that it is objectively bad. It seems like the vast majority of times I hear people invoke the objectivity-subjectivity split, it's within this context. It's used to explain the discrepancies between a person's values and either their own opinions or the opinions of others. With the observational approach, however, none of this is really necessary. Unlike the prescriptive approach, which regards values as a set of instructions on how to assign opinions, in the observational approach, values are more like a hypothesis, a tentative way of explaining a set of opinions. Let's return to our example from earlier. Under the prescriptive approach, this person would say, well, even though I like this book subjectively, it's objectively bad because it lacks character development. Under the observational approach, however, they would instead say, maybe character development isn't as important as I thought it was. As a result, you never really have the kinds of conflicts that you do with the prescriptive method. This is why I say when you tend to look at things a certain way, the differences between objective and subjective tend to disappear. Whereas with the prescriptive approach, one would say, subjectively, I like it, objectively, it's bad. With an observational approach, this becomes, subjectively, I like it, and objectively, I like it. Now, I know a lot of people's immediate reaction to this will be, well, hold on a second, that's not an objective statement. But I just have to ask, why can't it be? I mean, let's really think about what that means. When we experience a work of art, our brains are basically undergoing a set of electrochemical processes that should be describable in purely physical terms. If we had perfect information, we might be able to write out all of these details, every chemical reaction, every neuron firing. It might take a stack of papers the size of a skyscraper to write it all out, but there's no reason it couldn't be done. And another observer with similar omniscience could come along, read this description, and say, yes, I can confirm that this is what happened. And isn't that the very definition of objective? Something that is able to be independently verified by multiple observers? We may not have perfect information, and we may not be able to read minds, not yet anyway, but our capability of observing what goes on in the brain is improving every day. We now have technology like fMRI that can give us a general idea of what people are feeling by showing us what parts of their brain are lighting up in response to stimuli. It can even allow a computer to guess what letter a person is reading on a screen simply by looking at their brain activity. And it just so happens that Hollywood is already using this technology to get an idea of how people respond to its movies and trailers. So with all that in mind, it seems perfectly reasonable to me to say that opinions have elements of both objectivity and subjectivity. They're objective in the sense that they can be theoretically confirmed by independent observers, and they're subjective in the sense that they're descriptions of unique individual experiences. So going back to the question, can we call I like it an objective statement? Well, sure we can. So why don't we? Or at least, why isn't that the norm? Well, I feel there's a certain conventional wisdom that associates values with objectivity and opinions with subjectivity. And I get it. In a lot of contexts, this makes sense. Values are something like broad principles. They're stable and reliable, whereas opinions are basically feelings, which are fickle and unreliable. In a lot of circumstances, relying on your feelings is a pretty terrible method of discerning truth, and placing feelings over principle can often be an express lane to hypocrisy. This is something that people understand intuitively, and I think that's why the prescriptive approach seems to be a more conventional approach. But this framework fails us when we're talking about artistic quality, which is a matter of perception. In the context of perception, feelings aren't these fickle intruders that come in and meddle with our data. Rather, feelings are the data. And if feelings are data, that means subordinating them to a higher authority isn't logical or scientific. It's the exact opposite. It amounts to changing the data to fit the theory, when we should be updating the theory to reflect the data. And not only is it counterproductive to change the data, it's also not really possible. The data is what it is. I mean, sure, opinions can and do change over time, but what you can't do is go back in time and change how you felt at a particular moment. Once you experience a work of art and form a reaction to it, that reaction is written into the physical history of the universe. You can't change it. At best, you can change your stated opinion to more closely match what you think you should feel, but you can't change how you actually felt. This is why the prescriptive approach has the potential for cognitive dissonance, and the observational approach doesn't. Because while you can make values dependent on opinions, you can never make opinions entirely dependent on values. Opinions will always vary independently to some degree. Getting back to the overall question of objectivity versus subjectivity, to summarize, I think that at its core, this debate is really about values and opinions. The objective camp subscribes to a prescriptive approach that assumes values are objective and opinions are subjective. When there is conflict between values and opinions, as will inevitably happen with the prescriptive approach, it necessitates a kind of split into two different stances. an objective stance and a subjective stance. The classic rebuttal from the subjective camp is to say that values aren't objective, but this strikes me as an incomplete refutation because it doesn't really challenge the objective camp's root prescriptive assumption about the relationship between values and opinions. And besides that, by saying art is entirely subjective, I think an important point is missed, which is that there is an objective component to opinions. The observational approach acknowledges this, and in doing so recognizes that opinions are actually the most reliable tools we have for evaluating art. And so, from an observational perspective, objectivity and subjectivity, they're still separate concepts. It's not like they're meaningless, but there's just no practical need to ever draw a distinction between them, because they'll always give you the same answer. It's like, who cares, right? If we look at things objectively or subjectively, it doesn't matter because it doesn't change anything. There's no conflict. And if there's no conflict, then the whole premise of the objective versus subjective argument evaporates. Another way to summarize might be to say that the two approaches I've described seek to answer fundamentally different questions about art. The prescriptive approach asks, what is the quality of this work? While the observational approach asks, why do I feel the way that I do about this work? The question of objectivity versus subjectivity might be a relevant one if you're starting with the why and looking for the what. But if you're starting with the what and looking for the why, it couldn't be more irrelevant.